Well, hello, my name is Ian Burrow. I'm on the board of the Hopewell Museum, and I'm also an archaeologist, and I have my own little consulting firm called Burrow into History. What I want to do with you today is to go through some of the many wonderful American Indian artifacts that we have in our collection here at the museum, talk about various aspects of how they're made, how old they are, and what they tell us, of course, about the life of American Indians who lived in this area for more than 10,000 years before Europeans arrived on the scene. We really have quite a nice collection here at the museum. It's many hundreds of artifacts. Most of them are from this local area, the local Hopewell Valley area. Some of them probably from a little further away. Many of them were donated by local people who liked collecting these things from farm fields around the township and the nearby areas, and they donated them to the museum. One particular person is Carl Maple, who lived on Cold Soil Road, just over the border in Lawrenceville, who donated many of the artifacts that we're going to be talking about here today. So when people think about American Indian artifacts, I think the first thing that comes to mind, obviously, are arrowheads, things like this, which we have many, many, many. And so I thought I would start by talking about these. As you can see, there are a great many varieties of size and shapes of these objects. And obviously, those differences in shapes and sizes are trying to tell us something about what these were used for. We can learn a lot about that from looking at them, looking at the material that they're made of, the different kinds of stone. And we can work with the research that's been done by many other archaeologists over a long period of time now to help us to identify these artifacts by name and by date. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. I thought I would start off by showing you a couple of our very oldest artifacts. This is the very oldest one that we know of at the moment in our collection. As you can see, it's a beautiful object. It's about 4 inches long. This is obviously the business end, the point end. And this is the end where it would have been held into some kind of wooden or perhaps bone shaft and used as a spear. And these little notches in the side were probably to help you to wrap cord of some kind around to hold the spear point onto the shaft. We know that this particular style of object is around 9,000 years old. As far as we know at the moment, it's the oldest object in our collection. Now, you'd probably say, well, how on earth do we know that? And the answer is that in other places, in other parts of North America, points like this, objects like this, have been found in places where you can get a date from associated material, usually charcoal or bone, and we can date that material by a technique called radiocarbon dating. And so when these kind of objects are found with that kind of material, it gives us a sense of how old they are. And that's the truth of many of the other ones that I'll be showing you. So this is our oldest one. When this was being used, there were probably still some of the very glamorous prehistoric animals around in this area, like mastodons and giant beavers and things like that. This is our next oldest one, and it shows you very much what a great range of style and material these objects are made of. Archaeologists call this little one a LeCroix point. And as you can see, it has two little kind of ears at the bottom. That's the distinctive thing about it. This one is made of a beautiful pinkish quartz crystal material. And this one is about 8,000 years old. So it's about 1,000 years younger than the big one that I just showed you here, this one, which we call a Dalton point. Now, let me just talk briefly about the terminology here. Conventionally, everybody sees these things and calls them arrowheads, which is quite understandable, and some of them really are arrowheads indeed from use as with bows and arrows. But many of the other ones have different functions. For instance, this big one I just showed you is not an arrowhead. Neither is this one. It's too big, as you can see, to be used really on a bow and arrow. And so archaeologists call these things usually projectile points, which is to get around the problem of is it an arrow or is it a spear or a dart, by which we mean a throwing spear. So we call them projectile points. And another phrase you will hear used about them is biface. And that's referring really to not so much to what they were used for, but the way they were made. This one is a very good example of a biface. And what we mean by that is something that's been made by chipping away the stone very carefully from both sides to make a sharp edge. This is a particularly good example. You can see how the person who made this has flaked the stone away very, very carefully to make the shape that they want, and have done this on both sides. So that's a biface. And this one is quite young, really. This one's probably only about 4,000 years old compared to the ones that we were just looking at. But you can see again how very distinctive these different shapes are, and also the different raw materials, the different stones that were used. And these pieces of data put together can give us an idea about what's going on, who's using what kind of stone at what kind of time. And we're only at the beginning of analyzing this collection at the moment for those kind of pieces of information. But in the future, we'll hope to be explaining all that in our new displays, which we'll be creating in the next couple of years. So these raw materials, the stones, are mostly local, which is another clue, of course, to the fact that these are probably all found locally. The most common stone that we find being used for these projectile points is this rather boring-looking greenish-brown stuff called argillite. And argillite outcrops only about half a mile from here, north of us here, on the southern slopes of Sowland Mountain. And there are other deposits up in Hunterdon County, north of us here. Now, the thing about argillite is that when it's fresh, when you get it out of the ground and start making it into things, it's very, very sharp. It's absolutely as sharp as this one, which is made of a type of stone called jasper. But unlike the jasper stone and the quartz stone that we saw, this argillite material gets softened and eaten into by the acids in the soil. And so projectile points made of argillite tend to look really kind of poor and not particularly good. And a lot of these are like that. But be assured they would have looked much better than that when they were brand new. So let's look at some other things that are made with this bifacial technique of hitting the stone with another stone to make these flaked stone objects, which can be so very attractive to the eye. So here's a couple more made in exactly the same way as this one, with this bifacial reduction technique, as we call it. But you can see that these are not probably projectile points, because they're not anything like an arrow or a spear in shape. But they've been made, again, as I say, in exactly the same way, with the flakes being taken off on both sides to make really a very respectable cutting edge. And once you pick an object like this up, you can almost immediately see what it's for. As you can see here, it's a knife. It fits very well in your hand like this. So does this one. And it was probably hafted, as we call it, attached to a wooden or bone handle here by means of glue and cords of rawhide or vegetable materials. We have found in some parts of the country, not round here, examples of these things still with their shafts on them. So we know quite well how they were used. And this is you can tell this is a very, very useful, multi-purpose tool, both of these knives. And so this technique of making stone tools by flaking them bifacially to make edged tools has a very, very long history. It goes right back even to older than our Dalton point. The oldest artifacts in North America are several thousand years older than this, and they're made in the same kind of technique, this bifacial chipping and flaking away to make the shape that you want. And this goes on right the way through, right up until the time of European contact. I'm just looking for one of our latest arrowheads here. This really is an arrowhead. This one, as you can see, is a triangle, really a simple triangular shape. The tip has been broken off, and the base is a little bit sort of curved to help get the shaft material onto it. Quite small. This is indeed an arrowhead, and this is the kind of arrowhead that the Lenape Indians were using at the time that Europeans started to arrive in the Hopewell area in the late 1600s. And at that time, we can indeed call them the Lenape. We know that that's what they call themselves, and this is one of their artifacts. But it's made in the same way, bifacially, chipping and sometimes kind of grinding, but mostly just chipping away very, very carefully to make the shape that you want. It always occurs to me that in any of these communities, there was always somebody who made these better than everybody else. And so if you wanted a nice new arrowhead, you would go to that person and probably give them something that you'd hunted in exchange. And there's always people who are better at some of these things than others. So that's something of the story of the projectile points and arrowheads and spear points that we have in our collection.